A history of God. The Babylonians saw the swampy wasteland of Mesopotamia as a primordial stuff of divine origin that existed for eternity. El was the elite deity of Canaan. Yam was a deity that Balhadad wanted to kill, and El's wife was compassionate, and Balhadad felt ashamed, and so did not kill Yam. Yahweh marked his people out from all other nations. Yahweh is made equivalent to El in the Bible. Yoshia returns to the worship of just Yahweh, and the reformers rewrote Israelite history. Yirmiah felt intense pain for needing to rebuke the people that he loved, since Yahweh wanted the prophets to sever the ties to mythical consciousness or perspective. Yirmiah's anger here could show that extremes happen when you go into alternate states. Earlier prophets of the Bible believed in dashing babies' heads out, whereas later prophets like Isaiah were more tranquil. The purpose of the Pentateuch was to act as a Pneuma Elish, to enthrone Yahweh and as the creator and ruler of Israel. In the Near East, temples were a way to replicate the cosmos, a way at imitating the gods, enabling humanity to participate in the creativity of them. And so the temple of Judaism was a way to imitate gods and to hold on to what we used to do in the ancient world. And so without realizing it, we're actually emulating, pagan. Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to introduce the cult of Zeus into the temple. Prior to that, Zeus and Dionysus were worshipped alongside Yahweh by many Greeks who found a similarity between the gods. It shows you that the Jewish god Yahweh was anthropomorphized in such a way that Greeks can appreciate. In Greece, a conservative Jew warned that we should worship Sophia, but said we got to be careful. Sophia is the wisdom of God, basically. It's the feminine part. And someone who mentions this a lot and was deemed a heretic, but he wasn't a real heretic, was Ben Sira. But I don't believe Ben Sira is mentioned here in this section. Philo said, he was a philosopher, that we can never reach God himself. The highest truth we can apprehend is the rapturous recognition that God utterly transcends the human. Philo was so influential that when he passed away, there were pogroms against the Jews because he was holding a kind of protection. 1/10 of the Roman Empire was Jewish. The religion of God became a patriarchal organization later on because the rabbis started instituting mitzvot that apparently, based on the history, was not brought down the way that we believe it is. Meaning they said it was about men fulfilling mitzvot, and women, they were just blessed by God. And the blessing to not be a woman was because we're thankful that we weren't given a restriction of mitzvot, but really the mitzvot were added on by the rabbis who claimed it was a tradition from Sinai. And there was a tradition from Sinai or something, but the details were created by the rabbis, but they philosophically never want to acknowledge that they were creating it as a kind of patriarchal cult. What's fascinating is the Romans accused the Christians of atheism. And this shows you that Christianity to the Romans was more non-pagan than other religions. Platonists believed that God was not an alien object, but our best self. It comes neither by knowing nor by intellection, and that discovers the intellectual beings in the mind, but by our presence, overpassing all knowledge. He loved Hindu philosophy and Buddhist ideals in India, where he was so keen to. Arius' God was close to the God of the Greek philosophers, remote and utterly transcending the world. So too he adhered to a Greek concept of salvation. According to Athanasius, the Logos have been made flesh to give us life. The Logos must be of the same flesh nature as the Father. All this caused them to look down upon women, apparently, and and all sexuality. And this was ironic because you just said that the God, the Redeemer, is in the flesh, God. And so you would think that they would praise the body and sexual drives, but it actually made it worse, made them less appreciative of it. And that's something to delve into, why that took place. Denies believe that, he's a philosopher, that you cannot even use the word God at all. God is not one thing that exists and is quite unlike anything else in our experience. It is more accurate to call God nothing. During the last phase of the pre-Islamic period, known as Jahiliyyah, there was a lot of conflict between tribes, and that was leading to destruction of resources. There was spiritual inferiority among the Arabs because the Jews and Christians kept giving them the impression that they were just this barbarous people who never had a revelation by God. Al-Ash'ari disagreed with the Mutazilis, who were basically rationalists. They felt rationale could prove God's existence. Felt more like denies the Areopagite, who believed that paradox would enhance our appreciation of God. He refused to reduce God to a concept that could be discussed and analyzed like any other human. Ibn Sina felt that the Prophet Muhammad was superior to any philosopher because he was not dependent upon human reason, but enjoyed a direct and intuitive knowledge. I just want to comment that the concept of ex nihilo is really important to philosophers, and I just want to say that if you believe in the multiverse, meaning everything happens simultaneously, then all of a sudden ex nihilo is irrelevant, because everything is happening everywhere, and it's arbitrary where it begins. But you can argue that a linear timeline makes more sense, but it's a never-ending debate, and the mind will probably create that, so it gets facilitated in the tangible world. So I don't really believe in talking about that, but this was a big discussion. Sadia ibn Joseph believed that God was not entirely accessible to human reason. In the background, you probably heard someone honking, so that had to do with the ego, who's part of materialism, who wants to believe, everything could be confined. So that's like a fluctuation matter, just besides philosophical concept of gnosis. Ibn Rashid believed that the acceptance of certain truths was essential to salvation, a novel idea in the Islamic world. Erigena believed in paradox. It's the paradox that reminded us of the limitations of our human understanding. And so God is both everything and nothing. In two terms, balance one another and are held in creative tension to suggest the mystery which our word God can only symbolize. The mystics believed that the idea of a personal God can only be a stage in our religious development. Another limiting facet the mystics picked up on is the fact that God has a gender, and they were evolving at some point to realize that we got to stop with this. It's all meta. The Greek word for mysticism is derived from musteion, to close the eyes or mouth, basically darkness or silence. Now, the rabbis hated the spirituality of the mystics, specifically because it placed God on a throne. So ironically, the rabbis were actually more straightforward, more to the point, and rational. So Jewish mysticism kind of made everything convoluted and fluffy, right? And so they were kind of against throne mysticism, which would eventually become modern Kabbalah. Simeon of small monastery of St. Macarius in Constantinople, he felt that God was known and unknown, near and far. Instead of attempting the impossible task of describing ineffable matters by the word alone, he urges monks to concentrate on what could be experienced as a transfiguring reality in their own souls. So this kind of has an allusion to non-duality. So you see, we're getting closer to more Eastern thinking, or a kind of globalized philosophy is taking place throughout history. In the beginning, even the rationalist Mutazilas supported the Sufis because they had a lot in common at first. Ibn al-Arabi believed that the imagination was a tool that God gave to us to use, and he believed in archetypes, meaning he believed that you should use conceptions like archetypes despite the truths of everything being in the. To the Kabbalists, God was essentially unknowable, inconceivable, and impersonal. They called the hidden God the Ein Sof, literally without end. Unlike Yahweh, Ein Sof had no documented name. He is not a person. Indeed, it is more accurate to refer to the Godhead as it. This was a radical departure from highly personal God of the Bible and the Talmud. The Kabbalists evolved their own mythology to help them explore the new realm of religious consciousness. So what's interesting is I actually find this to be progressive, because they're removing conception or form, from, you're taking that and you're moving away from the anthropomorphic. And so it actually goes back to old traditions that say God was either light or the sun or a fire. Now, of course, we don't say God is fire, but the truth of the old religion starts to take hold in what God actually was in the origin of things. The original sphere. Rabbi Abu Lafia was a Kabbalist who was believed to be the Messiah by both Jews and Christians, actually mostly Christians if I'm not mistaken. He actually believed that he himself was the Messiah. Interesting. Jewish mystics were always reluctant to claim a union with God. Now, I would like to say the reason for that is because if you say union with God, then you say you're a prophet, right? Which is taboo. Or you say you're one with God, you are God, like Jesus. And so that gets misunderstood too. And then a new religion comes off of that where men get worshipped and the essence of God is not understood. So that's the reason why they don't want to say it. Keter includes 3 spheros, Chachma Bina with Keter, and they are derived from Adam. Matthias Grundelwald believed that the Trinity was living within the soul and not an external reality out there. That makes sense. And a nice offshoot idea is that we all have the Trinity within us. We have a Trinity within us. But then you can also say we have 2 things, we have 1 thing, we have 7 things. So, of course, that whole idea gets questioned. The German philosopher and churchman Nicholas of Cusa felt that he was confident in our ability to understand. His conviction that God embraces everything, even contradictions, was close to the Greek Orthodox perception that all true theology must be paradoxical. Voltaire equated atheism with the superstition and fanaticism that the philosophers are so anxious to eradicate. And remember, Voltaire was anti-religion. So this shows you what's going on here, that there's something wrong with the psyche of atheists who actively have to deny God. Now, usually new atheism is where the denying comes in, but still, when someone calls them an atheist, in the modern era, it's usually anti-atheist. On a rare occasion, you have someone who is more agnostic but calls himself atheist for whatever. But as a clarification, the new atheists want to change people, whereas someone who doesn't want to would not be under a new atheist category. But usually, if they consider themselves atheists, they're usually willing to go under the category implicitly by wanting to convert people, because it has to do with wanting someone to believe in a specific thing. Spinoza was confused for an atheist, but he in fact did believe in. Our scientific understanding of the world shows us that it is governed by immutable laws. Nothing wrong. For Spinoza, God is simply the principle of law, the sum of all the eternal laws in existence. God is a material being, identical with the equivalent to the order which governs the universe. Like Newton, Spinoza returned to the old philosophical idea of emanation. That Spinoza probably was a pantheist. And there were elsewhere where he was asked, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And he said, "Yeah, I believe in Jesus." Not only that, he was the holiest and purest man of all. So he did have a form of spirituality that wasn't limited to rational states. So he did believe in alternate states, but he has to imply it, and he doesn't say it because it's not the norm of the rational paradigm. So the way I see it is he's just coming from the upper right quadrant. And the upper right quadrant is the most upper left quadrant the moment you are not biased. But generally speaking, the upper right quadrant is characterized by someone who is biased. So that's something interesting to consider, that he had spirituality emanating from the upper right. Spinoza felt our joy and happiness in knowledge is equivalent to the love of God, a deity which is not an eternal object of thought, but the cause and principle of that thought, deeply one with every single human being. Moses Mendelssohn's personal God was not metaphysical and abstraction. Human characters such as wisdom, goodness, justice, loving kindness, and intellect could in their loftiest sense all be applied to the Supreme Being. So I guess he understands that everything is a projection in his own way, and however you relate to it is how things go down. But people complain in the Jewish circles that what he ended up doing was give anyone any religion they can follow, and so they'll just marry out, and that's what they did. Their kids became Christian. And so they lost their culture. So that's the argument against Moses Mendelssohn's ideas, is that he's too passive in how he approaches it and doesn't have enough bottom right quadrant. He doesn't have enough framework to solidify beliefs because he doesn't care, basically. He didn't care enough about that taking place. Once again, that's my personal opinion. Everyone will have. Shabtai Tzvi was accepted as the Messiah, converted to Islam. This devastated everyone, and they made sure that his name was eradicated from everywhere. So Cardozo felt there were 2 gods, basically the God of creation, and then there was the God of the Bible. And that's where all the confusion comes in. That's his. And come to think of it, I've drawn similar conclusions that, yeah, there was a natural first cause, or causes. That's a general flow, or I guess dharma. And then there are the archetypes. They're the gods. One God. Because it's anthropomorphic, we say that it's actually a real God, and that's what I concluded. And so I'm not going to say I agree with him, because a lot of the stuff here, I'm just on a different wavelength. Like he says that Jews were condemned to be exiled, to be apostates, and they could be saved through. Yeah, so he has all his beliefs, but there's certain principles that I kind of see the truth in, which is interesting. You can see clearly that he was an extremist, because look what he says. He says that Shabtai Tzvi he performed this painful task on his behalf of apostatizing Jews for him. So, I'm not going to call him arrogant, but there was some delusion brewing beneath his consciousness, even if he has some nice idea. Abraham Joshua Heschel would eat meals to reclaim the divine spark in the food. He would eat huge meals. So this demonstrates his Hasidic affiliation. Like the Greeks, the Hasidim considered the tzaddik this avatar of divine proportions, and there was almost a deification attached to him. So if you're a Hasid, you don't realize that you're doing it, but you're worshiping a person. You just don't call it that. And so that's one of the issues that comes around with Hasidic Jews. And there's nothing wrong with worshiping a person or a rabbi, but the issue is to be in denial about it. Heck, I wouldn't want to be worshipped, I've been sitting here for like 8 hours, and no one's worshiping me and patting me on the back. Karl Marx saw religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the opium of the people, which made the suffering bearable. Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God was dead. Sigmund Freud regarded the belief in God as an illusion that mature men and women should lay aside. The idea of God was not a lie, but a device of the unconscious which needed to be decoded by psychology. A personal God was nothing more than an exalted father figure. Desire for such a deity sprang from infantile yearnings for a powerful, protective father, for justice, fairness, for life to go on forever. Now, I find this interesting because I've had mystical experiences. I've encountered God, and I met people who encountered the same exact God, and there's a collective unconscious. So when you bring in Jung, I don't think Jung would be so harsh to people believing God. It's not just about believing God. It's about the truth of what lens you adopt God as. Is God this way or is God that way? Is God a part of your undeveloped brain? Or maybe it's an integral part that exists all across the spectrum, regardless of how developed you are. That's the question that we have. And the way I understand it, the rational paradigm was Sigmund Freud. People integrated into stage orange capitalism. So of course you're going to deny anything that resonates as the classical monarchical tyrannical God, because it's juvenile and it's oppressive and old-fashioned and abusive. But when it comes to the truth of the unconscious mind carrying that, then you can't disqualify it. Alfred Adler allowed that God was a projection like Freud, but believed that it had been helpful to humanity. C.G. Jung's God was similar to the God of the mystics, a psychological truth subjectively experienced by each individual. I actually agree with this. I've encountered many different types of single gods, so I know this to be true. Jung's continued faith suggests that a subjective God, mysteriously identified with the ground of being in the depths of the self, can survive psychoanalytic science in a way that a more personal anthropomorphic deity who can indeed encourage perpetuity and maturity may. Judaism wanted to get rid of Kabbalah because of the Shabtai Tzvi movement. It was embarrassing. Zionism was a religion without God. Positivists believed that religious belief represented an immaturity which science would overcome. Richard Rubinstein agreed with Sartre that life is empty. He saw the God of the mystics as an imaginative way of entering this human experience of nothingness. Rubinstein himself preferred the God of the Jewish mystics. He was moved by Isaac Lurie's doctrine, God's voluntary act of self-estrangement which brought the created world into being. All mystics had seen God as a nothingness from which he came and to which we will. Jesuit Karl Rahner saw Jesus as an ideal that we can become, and that God is a supreme. Ever since the prophets of Israel reformed the old pagan cult of Yahweh, the God of monotheists has promoted the ideal of compassion. Albert Einstein had an appreciation for mystical religion. He did not believe his theory of everything should affect people's conceptions of God. Human beings cannot endure emptiness and desolation. They will fill the vacuum by creating a new focus of meaning. The idols of fundamentalism are not good substitutes for God. If we are to create a vibrant new faith for the 21st century, we should perhaps ponder the history of God for some lessons and warnings.